It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. Black Friday Game Day on Prime is an epic day of live sports. It all starts at 9 a.m. Eastern with the Capital One Skins game. Then, Black Friday football returns when the Bears take on the Eagles at 3 p.m. And it culminates with the final night of Emirates NBA Cup Group play with Bucks Knicks at 7 p.m. and Mavs Lakers at 10 p.m. Black Friday Game Day, only on Prime.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
When I used to take American servicemen around the city during the Iraq insurgency, because urban warfare was the thing, I would walk them around, and one of these special services guys said to me, put a pencil in the bullet hole and you'll see where the bullets are coming from. And it's very interesting. We were at one point and the bullets were literally coming from all different angles. And that told me a lot. All different angles. It was remarkable. There are points, almost points within the city where you have 3 or 4 different directions of fighting taking place all at the same time.
Hello. The great city of Aachen was of key strategic importance during the Second World War. The seat of the Holy Roman Emperor Charlamagne, it is a wonderfully beautiful baroque city of stunning architecture, best exemplified by its cathedral. However, early on in the war, the RAF began a bombing campaign that had devastating consequences, not only for the civilian population, but also for US troops who would endure fighting reminiscent of Stalingrad at the end of 1944. Friend of the show Philip Blood joins to discuss a fascinating episode in the last year of the war as he talks about his new book, War Comes to Aachen. Plenty more history on the way, so please do subscribe or follow. And if you can write a kind review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, I'd be most grateful. I've seen recent reviews that have warmed the heart, but in the meantime I'll hand you over to Philip talking Aachen, the Stalingrad of the West. Philip, welcome back to the podcast. And so today I have you alone, no Gordon Corrigan to cause trouble. And we're talking about your new book, War Comes to Aachen, the Nazis, Churchill, and the Stalingrad of the West. So that will help give the listeners an understanding of the title of the podcast. And so it's interesting. You were just telling me before we started recording that nickname, the moniker, the Stalingrad of the West, was applied to the battle and after the war, not
afterwards.
Yeah.
Great to see you before I dive in and we get carried away. And I'm pity Gordon's not here. I'm sure he would have told me how the battle really was.
Montgomery would have been blamed for something.
Yeah, even though he's like 200 miles up the road, It's all his fault.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. So what you actually find if you read the memoirs and the stories of the German side to the history of the actual fighting battle of 1944, the German, especially the German commander, kept referring to it as the Stalingrad of the West. So I just used it in the title, obviously because it's got that hook. It was a bitter fight, but it wasn't a Stalingrad. And 3 weeks, no.
Right. Well, okay, that's ruined it for 50% of the listeners. Don't turn off. Carry on listening.
So let me just say, here's the thing. The reason why it's not like Stalingrad in 1942 is because the Americans have got incredible firepower and the Germans just don't have any firepower. And so they melt very quickly. But you get these moments during the battle where there is such a vicious fight where almost the Germans actually pounce on the Americans from behind, having climbed through sewers, and literally dive on them. And it's hand-to-hand fighting of the most vicious kind. And that memory, that this is the thing, that memory of that vicious fighting was still being discussed and raised and mentioned in war films in the 1950s. And soldiers who had served in that battle would often say it was the worst fighting we've ever been involved in. Yet it wasn't, to the kind of scale that was taking place in Stalingrad 2 years before.
Also, I suppose, unlike Stalingrad, the defenders, and this is a spoiler alert for listeners, the Germans lost and the Americans were victorious. And it's interesting, your book opens with, I was quite interested to read a quote given by the commandant or the governor or the commander, I think
Commander.
I'm lucky there, commander
Commandant, yeah.
of Aachen, where he's giving a talk to his troops and he is explaining to them that, you've got to behave as Germans. And we could have carried on, but we've run out of ammunition, food. I've been ordered to carry on, but I'm telling you, you can stop. But at the so that seems, okay, that's unusual for many Nazis at the time. And the reason why I give him the name Nazi is because then he goes on to say, we're not allowed to say Heil Hitler, but we're all thinking it. And it's that sort of slight paradoxical element in that Hitler would have wanted him to go on fighting. He didn't, yet he's sort of thinking in his mind, Hitler lives on.
Well, we're in that last year of the war, and in that time there's been the bomb plot. So German officers suddenly go in strange ways. And what you see emerging are people like this man Wilk. Gerhard Wilk was the colonel commandant of the German forces defending Aachen. And he was a political soldier, and he had quite a fine record as a fighting soldier. But he's one of these colonels that emerge after the 20th of July, who hold defenses rigorously almost to the end. I mean, the problem he had was he only had 4,500 soldiers. He had 4,000 people living in the city's ruins because the city was already in ruins by that stage. And in addition, 2 detachments of Waffen-SS troops broke in at the high point of the battle. They actually got through the American encirclement, and that reinvigorated the fight. So you get a hard fight at the very beginning on the 7th to the 10th of October. Then it goes quiet for a few days. Then the Waffen-SS turn up, they reinvigorate Wilk, and they start fighting again. You get a few days, 3 or 4 days of serious hard fighting. And then they come to a point where Wilk and this SS officer decide there's no point in going on because they're not going anywhere. But because the SS officer is part of that Waffen-SS elite, they have to get out because there's few of them around, and they need to lead these kind of fights. Because what's actually happening in Germany is as there's a rising inability to put up a huge offensive action, they need these officers to run what I would call micro battles, where they carry the offensive of National Socialist vigor for a short period, maybe 2 to 3 days. And once it fails, they pull out and retreat. I mean, the classic obviously is Jürgen Piper in the Battle of the Ardennes. And he does that. They all do this thing, and it continues right the way through. And it becomes a very common trend amongst colonels and that level of command in certain troops, like the Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers, the Waffen-SS, and the panzer troops, right the way through to the very end of the war. They don't stop fighting. And they're incredibly political individuals, even though after the war they claim they weren't.
Well, the other thing is that, last time you were on, we were discussing Operation Market Garden, which is actually just finished when this battle kind of starts. Timing's roughly right, I think. And the scale is so different in that if listeners are thinking, oh, Operation Market Garden, I know what that is. I think the numbers of certainly British troops are 10,000, another, 10, 15,000 Americans, plus 30 corps. But this is far larger, really. I mean, you've mentioned a small number of German troops defending, but is it 100,000 American troops involved?
Well, it's a very confused and very busy battle because fighting in the city, you've got 3,000 German troops, but outside you've got all these German forces who are trying to pinch Aachen in such a way that they can hold the Americans. You see what I mean? They're trying to grab Americans by the collar, bring them into the city and bog them down and hold the advance. So that's what the Germans are trying to do. The Americans, to even complicate this thing further, you have an external encirclement, and then they have the internal break-in. So you've got one division, one regiment being assigned to the internal fighting, the urban warfare in the streets, 3 battalions. And then on the outside, you've got all these other divisions of several corps trying to hold the encirclement together, while at the same time fighting off repeated offensives by the Germans. So it's a very complicated battle. And while there's one group of soldiers involved in, quote, directly in the city, there's another group of American soldiers who are outside it. And that gets even more confusing, because if you try and look at all the different units, I know you don't want me to go down them, but if you're looking at Terry Hogan's task force that's doing this kind of swinging arch around the city, and then you've got the 18th Regiment with the famous Bobby Brown incident, where one soldier takes on a whole Siegfried line emplacement on his own and literally fights the Germans single-handed. You've got these incredible battles taking place, vicious fighting, and it's very complicated. And when you walk the ground, it's even more complicated, because you're thinking, blimey, there's only 200 yards between the encirclement troops and the fighting in the city. And who's firing on who? When I used to take American servicemen around the city during the Iraq insurgency, because urban warfare was the thing, I would walk them around. And one of these special services guys said to me, put a pencil in the bullet hole and you'll see where the bullets are coming from. And it's very interesting. We were at one point and the bullets were literally coming from all different angles. And that told me a lot about the confusion.
If you stick the pencil in the wall, it would be sort of going at all different angles.
All different angles. It was remarkable. Right. Truly remarkable. There are almost points within the city where you have 3 or 4 different directions of fighting taking place all at the same time.
Why is Aachen of such key strategic importance? I mean, couldn't the Americans have said, right, this is going to be a bit of a pain? I mean, it took them nearly a month to take. Couldn't they have just bypassed it?
Well, actually, it took a lot longer, because they arrive on the Siegfried line on the 10th of September, about 35 kilometers south of Aachen. Then they beat their way through to Kornelimünster, which is southeast of the city. Then they tried to push forward as they're going for the encirclement. Now, step back. The reason why Aachen is so important is because it's at a junction of 2 corridors. The Aachen corridor, which is the traditional route of armies moving north and south towards the Rhine or towards Paris. And you have the Stolberg corridor, which is another side channel taking you off. And whichever way you go, you will still end up either at Cologne or the Rhine River. So if we dial this back to, say, the Arnhem scenario, what you actually have is Bradley is doing a Montgomery, but with Aachen. Yeah.
Got
But
it.
he's doing it, he's fighting a different kind of battle. He's fighting maneuver warfare with urban warfare in a very confused fight. I'm critical of what he does, primarily because he doesn't commit enough troops. He's trying to do a large battle with inadequate levels of troops. And what you actually find if you read the combat reports, the American combat reports, and I've got virtually all of them, all of the officers who write those reports complain there isn't enough troops going into the lodgement or going into the attack. And that's very critical in what happens with Aachen, which is why it starts 10th of September and it's still, well, here's the thing, when does it end? Now, officially in my book, I've said the 21st of October. But if you're a German, the fourth battle of Aachen is the Ardennes.
At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form, and if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
And we should mention, just for listeners who maybe are unfamiliar with Aachen, you live there. I visited quite a bit when I was younger because my family lived nearby. And it is, well, the cathedral is the most beautiful building. It was the capital of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. It is of major cultural significance. And it is, even today, it's a wonderful city to visit. But it did fall victim to a huge amount of bombing. And that's something you deal with in the book as well. And this is sort of in the lead up and during the battle.
The thing is with Aachen, it's in a strategic point. And in the First World War, it was a jumping off point for the strike on Liège and the German march on Brussels. Come 1940, Aachen is the first raid on Aachen takes place on the 13th of May, 1940, the first bombing raid. And William Shirer, the famous American journalist, was actually in the city and witnessed it. So I have this record, which the Royal Air Force didn't have, of how these bombings took place, because he was down on the ground looking up, wondering what on earth was going on. And so he was reporting as an American war correspondent what was happening with the Royal Air Force Bomber Command in the initial bombing waves of 1940. And all he reported was this tale of woe of all these aircraft littered all over the place that had been shot down. And the fact that when they came to bomb Aachen, when he actually counted quite a number of aircraft, he wasn't sure the final figure, but the Royal Air Force confirmed there were 66 aircraft on the 22nd of June that bombed Aachen. And they missed all their targets, because if you assume they were going for the railway lines, well, they only hit the civilians. And if you assume that they were only hitting the civilians, well, actually, they were hitting all kinds of street roads, and it was all over the place. Then there was
this is a story that will be familiar to many, with Hamburg and many other German cities. Dresden is the famous one.
Well, they come later. The thing is, Aachen gets it from the very beginning, because it's only 350 miles away from Duxford, which became an American Air Force base. And in 42, 43, 44, when the Americans were bombing, they never bombed Aachen. Well, they did, but it was training bombing. But when the Americans were setting their codes for escort duties, the P-47s could fly as far as Aachen. Whereas with the RAF Bomber Command. Bomber Command didn't have any fighter escort whatsoever. So they would come in flying over the top through Holland and come south towards Aachen. Different ways of bombing. But Aachen was bombed over 127 times, probably about 80 times very heavily, and 4 times so heavy that it almost destroyed the center of the town. The interesting raid for you talking about Hamburg is the 12th and 13th was a fire raid, which the Royal Air Force declared as an arson raid on the city. And they used mostly phosphorus to burn the center of what was the medieval city. That destroyed pretty much all of the 14th to 17th century buildings. So that if you think of Baroque Aachen, that disappeared that night. And there's maybe 3 or 4 buildings which survived, primarily because they didn't have wooden roofs. There's one that's become a little restaurant that quite a few people frequent, but they have no idea of the history. There used to be a massive, great big car park behind it. And that was the aiming point for the RAF Bomber Command, which was about 100 meters from the cathedral. There's all these stories that the Royal Air Force were not committing to culture war. And I don't mean culture war like we have today. I'm talking about how it was in the past, where, you know, if you destroy Charlemagne, you're destroying a German hero. So in Harris's thinking, that's an acceptable target because you're destroying an aspect of what's making Germany be what it is and the way it's going to fight.
So that's very much in the minds of the bombers. This is Charlemagne's city? It's therefore a legit target.
Yeah,
really. I mean, it's extraordinary, actually.
They have a Baedeker book, which they put together in 42 and then produced again in 44. And every time in their targeting, it's the cathedral, it's the Rathaus, it's the medieval center, it's the culture. And to actually be writing that, and then that's the main target, it becomes quite fascinating. So you probably notice in the book, I got my friend from Fallout to actually produce a more graphical picture of the destruction that was being imposed on the city, rather than to show the photographs. Because the photographs, okay, you see, you know, like this one, where you see unpleasant stuff all over the place.
From such a high level as well.
You can't make it out. I mean, my house is in that picture, but, you know, you have to really look.
The height at which a plane has to fly to capture the size of your house is so high. Such is the size.
Well, the 1st of January right the way through to the 11th of April, every day Aachen is bombed.
And these are bombs that are sort of you've mentioned phosphorus. They burn. Water doesn't help. In fact, makes it worse.
Yeah, you throw sand on them to prevent the ignition and to shut them down. But once they burn with air, they just keep going, and water just makes it worse. But what they had in Aachen to stop a lot of the effect of the phosphorus burn were young people. Young people defended the city. This story that the Luftwaffe was defending the city, the Luftwaffe was up there, but they didn't really care about the city. They were more about getting their tallies and scores. The people who were really defending the city were young kids who were running the flak guns. But in the cathedral, which you talked about, where Charlemagne's chapel is, they got a bunch of kids from the University Grammar School. Now, the University Grammar School is Catholic. The cathedral's Catholic. The community is Catholic. So Catholicism is very strong. And to save the cathedral is an even higher award than firing a flak gun. Now, if you can imagine the kids, when they get told they're going to fire flak guns, they can't wait to get out there and play with 88mm guns. And so if you read the stories of the kids, they're saying, you know, they were shooting, they would shoot down an Allied aircraft, and the next day they were all walking around with self-made anti-aircraft badges, which they'd applied to their own uniform. And in the end, the Luftwaffe let them wear them. I mean, that fascinated me, because initially the Luftwaffe were very, very strict and said, no, you haven't shot enough down to wear the badge. Then they turned it the other way and said, right, you can wear the badges. Now, obviously, it sounds fun, it sounds interesting, but unfortunately, like all of these things in war, there is tragedy. And the Royal Air Force, being the way they were, by 1944 realized where the flak positions were, and they sent a group of aircraft to just bomb one. And of course, some of the kids were killed, and the kids were then, those that survived were there to watch their comrades being taken away. And all of them were completely devastated when they heard their mothers wailing. So you have this other side of the story. So on the one hand, they're all wearing badges and it's exciting. And on the other side, you have the horror of the bombing. And of course, I think you might remember in one of the chapters, when the national alarm went off in 2017, people who'd been totally distressed and were still in care homes, when the alarm went off, they started to react. Many of them had been comatose for 40, 50 years, suddenly were diving under tables and seeking shelter and screaming and howling. So it shows how bad that was. And of course, when I spoke to people in the community who'd experienced the bombing, there were some very tragic stories. My neighbor, his wife was caught outside of a bunker. She couldn't get in, and it left her speechless for 30 years. She was just in total shock.
Well, this is this level of total war that you put across in the book,
Yes.
really. And it's difficult to comprehend, certainly for, us in Britain. Were never invaded, though did experience bombing, but not on the scale that Germany did. Was that probably the main thrust that you wanted to get across in the book, the total war aspect that Aachen experienced?
Well, I suppose my interest in total war is that it's come again in the book Putin's War, which Ian McGregor reviewed for me.
Yeah, I'll put a link in in the show notes.
There's a big mention about Mariupol and what happened there and the other Ukrainian cities. And it struck me that urban centres have become once again the centres of extreme violence for invading armies. And what I found with total war was, I was going back obviously to studies in the 1990s when I was part of the Total War History Circle, organized by Stig Forster and Roger Chickering. I was really taken in by it because you look at military history in an inverted way. And although those guys were more into the social history, I was more interested in how you invert the look. So you're not looking on, or the gaze, you're not gazing on the soldiers marching through the city, you're gazing on the soldiers marching towards you as you are the city. And that changes the impression that you have of the way the war is developing. And as a consequence, total war looks a lot worse. And I don't mean that in the sense that I only wanted to put the most grievous stories in the book. What I actually did was to take the worst stories out. Because to create a sense of what was going on for total war, the average is what you needed, rather than just to take, if I put the worst stories out there, people would hook on the worst stories. They wouldn't get the impression of what total war is, which is of a constant form over a long period of time, with average things going on, the average being about 500 people being killed in a raid, but also 20,000 people having to be evacuated and maybe another 15,000 who are seriously injured and wounded. And of course, the 5,000 people are always blinded in a heavy raid. Similarly, when the troops are coming in and the people are living in the streets, trying to escape from being taken by the Nazis out of the city in evacuation, trying to be captured by the Americans, and at the same time not, it's an odd situation. They want to be captured by the Americans, but they don't want to be seen to be captured by the Americans, because then the Gestapo might come back and shoot them or hang them or whatever. So you've got these twisted tales of how people are surviving, and that gaze on how the Americans look and how the Royal Air Force appeared kind of changed my opinion. I think, just to add another point, I had tried to make a comparison with Manchester, because a lot of my family had been involved in the Second World War and the First World War, and I wanted to do a comparison between Aachen and Manchester, primarily because the people of Aachen had seen themselves as the next Manchester. Throughout the industrialization process, they'd expected to be Germany's Manchester with canals and all this. I mean, it didn't happen, but, expectation is what it was. And I couldn't do that on the British side. And if I had been able to, I'd have mentioned my uncle who was in the Blitz, who was completely traumatized by what happened on the Blitz on the 7th of September 1940. And he never recovered from that. It's a professional soldier, but the actual experience of the bombing and then having to save people, those stories were quite incredible. And of course, Manchester was bombed, and a lot of my area was bombed, my home area. And I wanted to try and do a comparison with that, because it's not so much how much bombing takes place, it's the impact of the bombing at a certain point that causes ramifications for a longer period. Manchester was bombed on Christmas Day. The ramifications lasted for 3 weeks. It's purely psychological. Aachen was bombed on Christmas Day in 1942. The ramifications were much longer. Yet the two heavy raids, there was a period of distress. Then the whole system came back together and people were suddenly handled, dealt with, evacuated, fed. It quite remarkable, but at the same time, as the bombing is going on in Aachen, the city is becoming paralyzed, and eventually it becomes a dead city. Whereas in Manchester, because there wasn't repeat raids, they were able to overcome eventually, and then the city, became the heart of the military-industrial complex. So different ways of looking at total war. There is an extreme, but it depends when that extreme really hits.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. We've mentioned Winston Churchill and it's mentioned in the subtitle. You write about him extensively, and since we're talking about the bombing, what role did he play then in the bombing?
I kind of take Richard Overy's view, which is he was not at all impacted by what happened in Poland and Rotterdam. He straight away said, we bomb.
When you say Poland and Rotterdam, i.e. in 1939?
In 39 and 10th of May 1940, I mean, those are famous incidents and periods in the bombing up to what happens in 1940. The thing with Churchill coming to power is he makes certain decisions which I can quite understand. What I don't understand with Churchill is much later, when Anthony Eden organised a study group to look at the effects by using Britain's extensive embassy system and diplomatic service, which went through the whole empire, which enabled them to use their diplomats to not so much interrogate, but to glean information from what people had experienced from the bombing. So you had all this information coming through, and very quickly, the chief of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Bentinck Cavendish, he started to realize this isn't working. In this study group where Frank Roberts was the coordinator, a very famous civil servant and Foreign Office official, he was trying to get as much information and study as to what was happening with the bombing just at the time as Harris was taking over. So you get this change of policy in bombing, while at the same time Churchill's got this kind of, it's not an opinion poll, it's not, it's like a study group that was canvassing every source possible. They were even taking off
To see the impact of the bombing.
to understand the impact of the bombing. They're even using post and telecommunications captures of enemy ships, which the Royal Navy captured, were then to get taken back to post office is in and telecommunications offices in Britain. They were translated, deciphered, and sent to this study group. So you had this huge material to know what was going on. You could actually work out, if you're in that circle, how effective the Rostock bombing was. So when Harris first attacked Rostock in, I think it was March 1942, they knew that the center of the city had burnt. They knew the details. They knew from Dutch workers who were sending messages via Sweden the level of the damage and where the bombs had landed. So that knowledge was feeding back into Britain. What Cavendish-Bentinck wanted to then do was say, okay, if this isn't working, we have to try and create a 1918 scenario, which is where the regime breaks down. The problem with doing that is the Nazis were completely fixated with 1918 never happening again. You know, where the German army collapses at the front, that affects and then the Civil War and blah. So which is why you don't get that happening in 1944-45.
There's no surrender.
No, there's no surrender. It's bitter to the end, and there is no collapse, except the final collapse when Germany's finally defeated. Churchill is getting all of this information from Anthony Eden in 1942, and they're still progressing with bombing. So they know it's not working. They know it's not achieving anything, and yet at the same time, they're continuing with it. And my argument was Churchill started to waver, and that was after the Dresden raid. The problem was that was a bit too late because they'd already gone through the process and they were still bombing relentlessly. Pforzheim and Wolfsburg literally disappeared as towns overnight. Okay, so you've got a weapon which is doing this and you have to keep using it. The problem is you're actually then, by 1945, making it worse for yourself to rebuild Germany because you've now gone beyond the other level. And when Churchill comes to write about his experiences of war, the famous history of the Second World War, it's the whole bomber thing becomes an afterthought. And another aspect of this, in terms of trying to cover his rear and give a more embellished picture of his capability as a war leader, and I do call him warlord, he doesn't push the intelligence knowledge he has. So all of this intelligence that he's received from the diplomatic service, all of the intelligence that they received from Bletchley is literally wiped. So people don't know about it. I mean, I just found these 200 files simply because I asked for question Aachen, and one of the files had Aachen on the cover, but nothing about Aachen in the file. So as you do, I tranched all the way through the whole lot, thinking somewhere in this lot there's going to be Aachen, and it wasn't. But what I did discover was that from the end of December 1941, right the way through till at least 1944, this central office of the Foreign Office was in existence. What then became interesting in 44 was it moved to Cambridge University and started to work on Churchill's election campaign. So they shifted from the bombing to work on Churchill's political campaign. And that struck me as very odd.
Well, Philip, this is a podcast that does not enjoy criticizing Churchill. I'll let you off. But I suppose the argument for the bombing campaign was prior to, I think, late 42. The British were really not succeeding in any way. And this was a way to hit back. This was almost like a morale booster for the British, in that they were receiving their own payloads from the Germans, and then, you know, the RAF bombing campaign, and then joined by the Americans to hit back. That's a way of Churchill demonstrating to the British people that they are fighting back, however futile it may be, in your view.
Obviously, I hear that argument all the time. I look at it from the return on investment. It is the biggest investment of the British Empire during the whole of the Second World War, by far more than the Army and the Navy.
They're losing a lot of men, the RAF, aren't they?
And then there's, of course, the story about them losing a lot of men. I actually see the Royal Air Force Bomber Command as being quite reflective of the nation. You know, I know Max Hastings said the officers, the number of casualties of Bomber Command was the same as the officers in the First World War. The thing is, with Bomber Command, it's not just officers who are dying, and officers don't pilot Lancasters all the time. You know, you have sergeant pilots who are flying bombers, in fact, whole crews of sergeants, working class men who literally go up time and time again, and they get DFMs instead of DFCs. So, you know, there is a whole tranche of, if you like, a working class element of Bomber Command, which isn't always reflected in the story. And I think that's fascinating to look at Bomber Command like that. But the problem is, if you look at Bomber Command as a strategic option, what are you doing with it? I mean, I would say bombing Essen 132 times in the hope of stopping Tiger tank production wasn't really very successful, because it didn't stop Tiger tanks from being produced. Another argument, which I'm often thrown at, is maybe they should have used it to stop the Holocaust. Well, you know, you can put 1,000 bombers up and the railway line will be running again in 7 days, because that's how good the Germans were at rebuilding the railway lines. I think the imagination for the bombing was limited. When they did use the bombing for a specific act, like the mosquitoes on the Gestapo raids and things like that, they have a great deal of success. But the blunt weapon, the bomber destroying cities, what you're doing is you're making a rod for your own back in the future. Because not only are you radicalizing the population, but you're making it very difficult to rebuild. And of course, when Britain takes the large bulk of northwest Germany,
including Aachen,
so the Americans capture it, occupy it, then it's passed over to the British. The British take control, and it is almost impossible to feed, because there just isn't enough people, there isn't enough resources. You can't rebuild because there's not enough work. There's not enough workers. There's not enough resources. There's not enough raw materials. So you've got people living in bunkers trying to do small rebuilds of the houses and the shops and the buildings and the electrics. I mean, the scale of work. I mean, I think at one point there's something like 2.8 quadrillion tons of rubble that has to be removed before you can make Aachen viable again. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, it is extraordinary.
And the fact that people are still living in the bunkers in 1955 gives you an idea of just how bad this situation is. And Aachen's not the biggest city. You know, Dusseldorf and Cologne, they're huge and they have the same problem. But go back on my criticism of how the weapon's used. It should have been used in a more operational manner to the armed forces, because when the armed forces wanted it, Harris was reluctant to use it and pass it on. And yet when it wanted to do pinpoint accuracy and take out important targets, it could do it. And then he would say, well, no, it wasn't possible to do that with the Bomber Command. Now, what's interesting is at the end of the war, Harris writes a report stating, here's all my photographs of damage. Here's 1,500 cities that I've destroyed. And this is what I did, and this is my plan, and this is my policy. The Air Ministry revoked him. They just said, no, that's not what you did. And you went against the plan. And there's this element where you suddenly realize everybody's dropped him.
Yeah, he didn't get...
No, he didn't.
didn't get knighted, did he?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah.
And he took the blame for the whole of Bomber Command. And I think, he should take the blame
Oh, he
for,
was knighted. Sorry, I've just checked that. He was.
but he wasn't a baronet, was he?
No. Yes, he was.
Was he? Okay.
I've just checked that. Yes, he was.
It's not a big deal with me on all of that, I'm afraid. I always,
No, but I think it probably is for. I'm just trying to think. But there was some. Churchill was very damning of him in his post-war writing, wasn't he?
he kind of ignored him.
Which I suppose says silence speaks volumes.
Yeah, David Reynolds made the point that, it was the big betrayal of Bomber Command by Churchill. And yeah, they're both of them are guilty for what actually happened. Could you have used that force more constructively? I think you could. I think you could have had better targeting. But if you try and say if, you get all the bomber lovers saying, well, you have to live with the facts. If you
Yeah.
show the facts are wrong, then it's usually that I get blamed for being a civilian, don't know anything about bombing.
Well, I think it's an argument that will rage for many, many years, as it has.
It will. I mean, I'm critical of Church, but I'm also critical of Churchill for trying to censor other people's history. He got his civil servants to prevent Lord Russell of Liverpool from writing his book, The Scourge of the Swastika. And that turned into a very nasty case. So, I'm all for Churchill having his memoirs if that's what he wants to produce, but to put these same group of people from the Foreign Office into crushing any other kind of writing, to me, I thought was wrong.
Yes, well, Philip, it saddens me that you say this about the great man. Very upsetting for me. But that's what makes, I suppose, he wasn't perfect, Churchill. And if we just turn back to Aachen, though.
Churchill came to Aachen.
When?
March 1945, just after the Dresden raid.
Right.
And he gloated. And Brooke was with him. They then went to Jülich. And of course, there's the famous incident on the Siegfried Line with Churchill.
So the fighting for the Americans in Aachen itself, what did you sort of discover from records of the American troops? Because it wasn't, as you already described, this sort of vicious hand-to-hand fighting.
If you interrogate the records, and when I mean interrogate them, you look at the way they were written and when they were written, you notice one thing: they were all written after the fight. What I discovered was that the history written by the generals had been written in such a way to really gloss over what actually happened. And a lot of the bravery of the American soldiers, the hard fighting, was not covered by their own generals. And I thought that was a huge shock. What did I think of the fighting? In the long run, I think the Americans, they were always going to win. It was just a question of how much firepower. I mean, the fact that they were putting in so much firepower in the end to remove these small units makes you wonder that, first of all, they went in light and then got a bloody nose and then decided to upscale and go heavy. But if you go back to the reports before they went in, they already thought they were fighting 52 companies of Germans. So why didn't they put more troops in the first place? And these things that I found when I was doing the research, I couldn't explain. It was just impossible to explain. There seems to me the greatest issue for Bradley was to outdo Montgomery. And he had a battle which he thought he had won perfectly. And then the American newsmen came in 2 days later. They saw the destruction of Aachen and realized they couldn't promote it in America because of the German population. But the Americans hadn't caused that damage. That damage had been caused by the Royal Air Force. So the poor American soldiers have fought and deserve all this glory, but they're denied the glory because their own press won't tell the story because it's too bad for the Germans, but that's been caused by the British.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Many contradictions in this story. And so I know you mentioned there's also an important element to this is the Holocaust, which you write about towards the end of the book. So what was the involvement of that in the Aachen story?
The thing about Aachen, it never really grasped Nazism. So when the Nazis came to power, there was a reluctance, and to a certain extent, there was a great deal of resistance and opposition. The people who Aryanized the city were the city's elites. So the business elites, the university elites, they Aryanized, i.e. they threw the Jews out of jobs and positions and careers and ghettoized them and then eventually had them evacuated. At the same time, the Nazis declared a form of war on the Catholic Church, and the vicious fighting between the Nazis and the Catholic Church was more intense right the way up to 1938. In 1938, there was a church statement, pronouncement that we can be Nazis, but we can also be Catholics. And for a certain period, there was a moment when it looked like everything was calming down. And it was in that calm that the incident where a German diplomat was murdered by a Jewish person, which led to Kristallnacht, the 9th and 10th of 1938, and the city synagogue was put to the torch. And the sad thing about the city synagogue, which was this beautiful ornate building from the 19th century, which reflected a Jewish relationship with the city going back as far as Charlamagne, right? So we are not talking about a small history of recent Jews. Jewry in Aachen went all the way back to almost the very beginning. Now they were going to destroy this Oriental synagogue. And when they did it, it was done in a way to give the impression that it was a public uprising of people suddenly so outraged at this diplomat being murdered that they were going to torch the synagogue. In the end, what actually happened was the police and the fire brigade took off their uniforms, put on civilian clothes, and the synagogue was torched by the fire brigade, which, you know, having been a Lloyd's underwriter and later as a commercial underwriter of properties, I find it astonishing that a fire brigade could actually burn anything. But while they're burning the synagogue, they're making sure the flames don't spread to the local buildings. Wow. Now, when that story first broke to me in the community, I looked at the story and I thought, where's the evidence? When I started to search the evidence, the fascinating thing was the Americans actually broke the story in 1944. They had all the details of the story in 1944. But when the British put everybody who was still alive into a court case, the first crime of humanity case after Nuremberg, the Americans didn't supply any information. The British had a difficult job trying to place individuals who were responsible for the destruction of the synagogue against what they'd done. And the Americans had produced this file, and I found the file. And the reason why it's a difficult case is because you've got what actually happened, what happened to the Jews themselves, the British case, and then the American case, and then you have to weave it all together. And I put that chapter at the end because it struck me that we've told so many stories about what actually happened in Kristallnacht, in Aachen and in Germany, but we've never really understood it and what the implications were afterwards, because once the synagogue had burnt, with the Jews then ghettoized, it was pretty easy to funnel them out of the city. And, you know, in some cities, there would be trains of maybe 2,000, 3,000 people leaving at any one time. In Aachen, the 779 people who were taken out of the city were taken out in small numbers, so it wasn't noticeable. And I refer to the life of Wally Hertz. She was a lady who tried to continue her life long into the Nazi period, and eventually she was deported in 1942, and she died in Sobibor, an extermination camp. And it's very sad because her husband had literally been at the heart of Aachen culture, promoting the local Ripuarian language here. It's got a very unique dialect and language here in Aachen, which is the area covering Maastricht down as far as Liège. You could actually cut this area out as a Euro region of its own. Of Germany.
It is an incredible area. It really is. Yes.
Yeah, we're different from that other lot over there.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are so many facets to this story, Philip. This has been really brilliant. So, listeners, there's links in the show notes to the book. The War Comes to Aachen. And I think, as we've kind of given an indication in today's chat, it's really not talking about sort of necessarily the military side of things. It really encapsulates the whole experience of the war for Aachen and puts it in its historical context. So, Philip, thank you.
Well, I hope it works.
It's been great. Thanks very much, Philip.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you again without Gordon.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more history on the way, so please do subscribe or follow. But until then, thank you and good night.